Literature of U.S. Enemies. The title of the forum, Literature of U.S. Enemies. The enemies must be in quotation marks. Marks call into question a word or a statement. According to whom? Enemies, according to whom? Who's going to define the enemies? And it's not the people of the United States. Did we instigate the Vietnam War? Did we start the invasion of Guatemala or Panama or Grenada? And we didn't do that. The so-called enemies of the United States have been designated as enemies, don't you think? By a small group of people in each case, in each war. Call them the military-industrial complex or the ruling elite, whatever name you give to our leaders. And these men, and for they're always men, aren't they? I can't think of an exception.
Condoleezza Rice.
Condoleezza was
breaking the glass ceiling.
Sorry about that. And these men have labeled the libeled nations, we might say, I say, we call them communist, we give them a label, we say they're communist, we say they're communist, and we target every one of their cities, every one of their major cities, prepared to kill them all as one thing, as communist, or we call them Sandinista or raghead. A friend of mine insists on referring to Iraqis as raghead. We're not very friendly anymore. Or we say Taliban, as though that word accurately describes the Pashtun, the largest minority in Afghanistan and western Pakistan. I wanted to bring my poster of the label Taliban, but I ran out of time. I was going to paint it solid black. So who are the enemy nations our leaders threaten, invade, occupy, and treat with shock and awe? I'm sure we all still tremble in our stomachs at the photographs of that bombing of Baghdad. The enemy are the people, and we have to say, no, it's not the people we bombed. And how do we know? How do we know it's not the people? Well, it's simple. We become informed about them, and then we discover it's not the people. And how do we do that? Well, we have done that. The Vietnamese leadership, for example, and the people of Vietnam made a clear distinction between the people of the United States and its government. The entire world knows Bush and Cheney and the Project for a New American Century, Wolfowitz and General Powell and the other, dragged us into invading Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of you may describe that a little differently about Afghanistan. And not the people of the United States. The people of the United States know the people of Afghanistan did not attack the United States, or they can learn it by learning about the people of Afghanistan. Some of you recall the proposal during the Cold War that the SU and the US, and it was always striking to me that those were mirror images, and there are several books on the United States and the Soviet Union as being mirror images, so I always say SU and US. That there was a proposal during the Cold War. I think there's only one person in the room old enough to remember this, that we should exchange 1 million people between the Soviet Union and the United States, and I thought it was a brilliant idea, and it would end the Cold War, but our leaders didn't agree to do that. Russians, Iranians, North Koreans, Iraqis, Afghans, are the interchangeable names of demonized enemies we're made to fear and to accept and slaughter because we know nothing about them. Grocers, lawyers, carpenters, librarians, all are reduced to a monstrous monolith to be bombed and burned. Those who are bullied or bullied on the schoolyard, getting a divorce, or have lost their job. Now, I could go on with this all day. I had a good time this afternoon riffing on this. Or worry about paying the mortgage, or fear their children's drugs, or haven't discovered Viagra yet, or cannot remember or walk as steadily as before. All are lumped into one group to make mobilization for killing easier. We might say we are here tonight then to celebrate one way people have opposed these cleansings. For literature is the supreme opposite, don't you think? The supreme opposite of labels and stereotypes. Of course, I'm prejudiced. Let me acknowledge I was a literature teacher for over 40 years. We might not be able to afford living in enemy countries as a Fulbrighter might do, where we could learn, or being there because you're a soldier there, where we could learn their extraordinary individuality up close. But we can learn about them through literature. Tonight, then, we'll discuss the literature of several enemy nations. And you hear the quotation marks around enemy nations. Imagine it, see it. Enemy always surrounded by quotation marks because it is a highly dubious word. Or in this case, former nation, now insurgents. Taliban literature. Jacob George, my relatively new friend, is here to tell you about Poetry of the Taliban. And the first time I heard the title of that book, I thought, Poetry of the Taliban? Well, the Taliban murdered little children and cut off heads. Well, this book is an eye-opener, is a stunning demonstration of the opposite of that. And Jacob will tell about the book and the poems, and he will sing a song too that he's created. Since all of the Taliban have been turned into fundamentalist fiends by our deliberately overgeneralizing government and corporate media, this book offers a surprising contrast. Jacob, by the way, is, let me go on with that, is a veteran of Iraqi occupation Afghan, 3 times, founder of an anti-war bicycling organization, Ride Till the End. He's a musician and a songwriter, as we'll hear tonight. We will discuss the literature of all 3 of the so-called axis of evil countries, the phrase emphatically surrounded by quotation marks. Kaveh Basri will discuss an excellent collection of Iranian poetry. Kaveh is a new friend of mine. Mr. Basri came to the United States to go to high school, lived most of his life in the Bay Area. He got an MFA in poetry from Sarah Lawrence and is now doing a PhD in comparative literature here, focusing on translation here at the University of Arkansas. He writes mainly in English and translates poetry from Persian. He also teaches Iranian film and literature this semester and an honors course on Muslim mystical poetry in the fall. This is such a dramatic change from when I first came here at the University of 1965. We have expanded our horizons here internationally in an important way, thanks to the King Fahd, what they call it, institute or program. He also is working on an anthology of modern Iranian poetry, which will include a lot of U.S. poets translating Persian poetry. And I want to quote Kaveh. I consider it a handshake between the 2 cultures. I really like that. I'm going to steal that and quote that a lot. Syria has not been invaded or threatened with invasion by the United States at present, but it has been labeled by the United States a rogue state and accused of nurturing terrorists. People my age remember that. Tamor, did I pronounce that correctly? Tamor?
Yeah.
El-Karim, close to your last name, El-Karim, and his wife Sheree are here tonight. They have recently come from Syria. He was if I might say, a former political prisoner. He is a medical doctor, former political prisoner and refugee. They are refugees from Syria. And I then will follow up at the end and tell about the literature of the other two axis of evil countries presented in literature from the axis of evil, Iraq and North Korea. I hope we have time to tell you about the astonishing revelations of the literature even of North Korea. And my fuller notes you can find on OMNI's website. Jacob George on Taliban poetry.
Okay, so Taliban poetry. I like to start off by thanking Dick for asking me to read this book, because I probably wouldn't have done it unless he asked me to do it. So I did it, and it changed my life. I don't know if many of you like poetry, but if you really want to understand the heart of something and look into its soul, you can read its poetry and get a pretty good idea of what's going on there. And that's not something I've done yet with the Taliban movement. I studied it politically, but I didn't study it personally. So that's where this book really stepped in and changed a lot of things for me, especially as an Afghan vet. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan. First was a month after September 11th, 2001, when I was 19. Another one a year later, and then another one 03 and 04. So it's a pretty formative time in my life. Never thought I'd be coming back around and doing this. And I'm glad it's happening. Thank you, Dick. So the Taliban is mostly made up of the Pashtuns, which is an ethnic group in southeast part of Afghanistan, on the border of Pakistan as well. Actually, the border of Pakistan separates this group of people, and that might be by design. So there are many other people involved in the insurgent movement or violent anti-occupation movement in Afghanistan, but we're going to focus on the Taliban tonight because most of this poetry is the poetry of the Taliban. And some of it is pre-9/11, most of it is post-9/11, but all of it is Pashtun. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because poetry for the Pashtuns is the most important aesthetic medium of traditional society. And you'll notice, if you decide to plow through this book, and I recommend everyone in here do this, that a lot of the poems end with "I am," and they state their name, and "this is my prayer," or "I am, please let this happen." And that's because these are a part of an oral tradition, and they're designed to be spoken out loud to groups of people. It's a prayer, and they perform these in front of each other. And I thought that they did a really good job of carrying that in this book. So I'd like to start off with kind of challenging the West's narrative about the Taliban and human rights violations. What became very apparent as I was going through this book was that the Taliban, by and large, does not hate women. There are plenty of women heroines in this book celebrated as heroes through the history of Afghanistan. There are women who write poems about being involved in the Taliban movement in this book. So that piqued my interest right off the bat. But I will say that the Taliban has definitely committed egregious human rights violations. But just like here in the United States, some people hate women, and some people are fighting the good fight for women's rights. I think there's a very diverse range of voices in this movement as well. You know, some people are extremely conservative, other people obviously aren't, because that is represented in this book. So also wanted to make sure that's known. They have done terrible things, but at the same time, those things aren't representative of the entire movement. It's kind of the best way to label this movement. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So, as they point out in this book, most of the Muslim world also sees the Taliban as fundamentalist and with strict conservative values, and there is truth to that. But there's also a theme of very delicate feelings of humanity in this book that also challenge that narrative. And some writers in here definitely sorrowfully acknowledge, even within themselves and in their own communities, the loss of some of this humanity. And I think that in itself says a lot about what's actually going on in this movement and how incredibly diverse it is. So I wanted to start this off by reading a poem by a woman involved in the Taliban movement in this book. And it's called "Give Me Your Turban." Give me your turban and take my veil. Give me the sword so that the matter will be dealt with. You stay at home. I am going to the battlefield. I will either free my dear land or we will make a new Karbala. Don't just call yourselves men. How long will you lie there asleep? You sit among the girls. May calamity fall down on your masculinity. Let me read that again.
She's not a pacifist.
May calamity fall down on your masculinity. Leave these long tales and don't get so emotional. Your cunning truths and lies make me laugh. The land which was set on fire is ablaze. What would you know about widows and orphans? That day will be my Eid in happiness, when the enemy of my religion and land walks into the trap of my influence. To he who will build my ruined land and establish a rule of what is true, will such a person come to life? Will such a person appear? I, Nazarite, am living in sorrow, the joyous life, the joyless life. I will know the joy of life once my prayer is accepted. September 15, 2008. A lot of this stuff is fairly recent, and I think that's really important to acknowledge, because this is a representation of this movement that is often characterized again as completely destroying the rights of women and children. And again, there are people who do things like that. Oddly enough, some of the main people who did things like that were people who were supported heavily by the United States and received most of the funding from the Department of Defense through the Soviet occupation. One person I can call to mind was the person responsible for throwing acid on women's faces. This person actually received most of the funding from the U.S. through the Soviet occupation. Probably the most hated man in Afghanistan at this point in time. So secondly, I'd like to move on to kind of this idea of the terrorist and how that's used, how the state uses that name to kind of defame resistance and insurgency. Before I really dug into this book, I didn't recognize the Taliban as a movement, so to speak. I recognize it as a reaction to Western occupation in Afghanistan. And I think that is a component of this, but it's a little more complicated than that. Unfortunately, I think most of the writing of the Taliban has been received by the West, specifically by American military analysts. Like, it's not most of our citizenry doesn't sit around and read Taliban poetry, but military analysts do, unfortunately, and that's the majority of who's exposed to this stuff. And they regard it as merely propaganda, and that's how it's marketed to most people. Propaganda being the use of emotional persuasion. I think there's some truth to that, because poetry is emotionally persuasive, but the state has their own forms of propaganda as well. Now, I will say that I and some other veterans that I call brothers who were in Afghanistan, actually one in particular, Brock McIntosh, him and I traveled back to Afghanistan in 2011 to embed with the nonviolent anti-occupation movement in order to organize against U.S. occupation forces in Afghanistan. And that was a very enlightening experience for us. But while we were there, we gained a real appreciation for Afghans all across the board, and they helped change us as people and as warriors. We also developed a great admiration for the Taliban and for the people who we were fighting against, more specifically the Pashtuns, because the Pashtuns have a historical legacy. They have seen the ruin of many empire. Unfortunately, they have suffered, but we're talking about some of the most fiercest mountain fighters on the face of the planet. And they've probably done more to crush empire than almost any other ethnic group on the face of this planet. And we feel privileged and honored and lucky to have gone there and come away with our lives. Because that's the level of skill, faith, determination, and heart that we went up against while we were there. And we honor them for that 100%. So, on that note, Afghanistan, if you don't know, is historically formative at the crossroads of empires. We're talking about Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and now the greatest assembly of military supermight ever assembled in the history of civilization. We've got over 50 countries involved in ISAF, International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, with the most wealth and technology that we've ever seen in one military force. We're fighting people with AK-47s and RPGs. We're 10 years into it and we're losing. I think that says a lot about what's going on over there and about what we're up against. So, I was talking to Brock McIntosh about this book. Once I started digging into it, I had to talk to him about it. I knew he would love it. And we got on the subject of what is a terrorist and what is an insurgent, and what defines those two things and what separates them. So, one of the things that is very apparent from the beginning, and that is an insurgency is not possible without popular support by the community and by the people that the insurgents are living amongst. Meaning you have to have people to house, you have to have food, you have to have water. There's a lot of logistical concerns. You have to hide people, you have to be able to transport a lot of things. And in order for a resistance movement on this scale to be resisting this force for over 10 years, there has to be some popular support within the community. So that's what we determined is an insurgency, an insurgent. An insurgent actually has a lot of support from their community, otherwise they wouldn't be able to be an insurgent. And a terrorist, by the standards of the state, terrorist, is someone who it just commits a random act. There's very little bearing behind that. And does not have greater support by the larger community. This is an isolated person, and these are isolated events by extreme fundamentalists, right? So, we toss this back and forth. An insurgency is basically a component of a movement. That's what it is. And this greater thing that's happening here is a movement against occupation forces. And anyone calling it a terrorist or a terrorist movement is mislabeling it And what we also discovered through discussing this was that it just might be the reality of the situation that terrorists don't actually exist. That a terrorist or terrorism is a state label that is put on an insurgency, or that is put on a resistance group, or that is put on freedom fighters in order to reframe the debate and make people scared of what's going on. So the further we got into this, the further we realized that terrorism is an illusion. Obviously, terrible things can happen, but people usually don't just snap and go out and do terrible things, right? There are political motivations behind these acts. There are years of oppression. There is a lot of violence, and there is hardening of populations through overexposure to violence for long periods of time that lead to things like this happening. This isn't just random acts of people striking back. So I'd like to read a couple of poems in here to talk more about what it means to be an insurgent. And you can feel some of the pride coming out in this. I'm going to read this. This is called Strongwilled. Don't raise your head. I am strong-willed. Cruel man. Don't spread your dollars around. I have a revolutionary religion. You best be leaving now. I have sons born of Malaya. Just ask the British. I have an army like Akbar Khan. Just ask the Russians. I can tell you tales of war. I made the Russians kneel. I have daring youths. I will sacrifice myself, for I have the Sharia of Muhammad. Jihad is my path ahead, and I will be proud to be sacrificed. What does the world matter? I have Muhammad as my leader. I devote my life to my religion. I long for the day of judgment. December 16th, 2007. Now, there's also some biting, witty humor in this poetry. It just blows me away. I love this book. Thank you, Dick. I was reading this out loud in my room, pacing all over the place like Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. My roommates are like, oh gosh, he's reading Taliban poetry out loud. So this one is called The White House. What a black ending the White House has left behind. Its whiteness turned black, and it left behind a black evening. Its black storm destroyed the well and broke the water pot. This is the reason the girls left the house and village behind. To their crown a necklace was also added. Their condition was to become a servant, so I left my position. Oh, you who tread the path where the British, the Genghis, and the Russians have proceeded, here, with each step, you pass a skull. Here, with each step, you pass a skull. Their hangover vanishes when they see the angry forehead of the cupbearer. The hangovers in the tavern left full cups behind. To those who watch gunpowder and blood and cries, the doves of the heart of Hekar left the roof behind. I want to point something out in this poem. It's January 5th, 2007. The hangovers vanish when they see the angry forehead of the cupbearer. The hangovers in the tavern left full cups behind. When I was in Afghanistan, there were still MiGs and tanks and Russian weapons laying all over the place, some on the sides of the road. You could see the relics of foreign occupation. They called them the tombstones of empires. So that's some of the hangovers in the tavern left full cups behind. They left their weapons sitting there fully loaded. They left weapons all over the place. They tucked tail and just got out as fast as they could. Here, with each step, you pass a skull. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If I'm put in danger, I don't care. If my body is split into pieces, I don't care. They turned our maiden's hands into soil and ashes. If my head is cut from my body, I don't care. Will I leave my property and I head for Islam? If my muscles are fried in the fire, I don't care. I said I leave my property and I head for Islam. And if my muscles are fried in the fire, I don't care. I said now, oh my God, accept my prayer. I said now, oh my God, accept my prayer. I said now, oh my God, accept my prayer. And if I spend the rest of my life in jail, I don't care. If I spend the rest of my life in jail, I don't care. 'Cause all I want is God's love. 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 Even if the smoke bursts into flames, I don't care.
Khalid Basri, a writer himself, will discuss an anthology of poetry from one of the axis of evil, Iran, and I think this is a magnificent collection of poetry. But we'll see what Khalid thinks about it.
And I found your conversation about the insurgents and terrorism very wonderful, and I found it very appropriate to be singing the song because they're all oral and they're meant to be explained. So they should be all sang like that for them to actually be moving, because that's what they are really. I'm grateful for Dick to set up this event and have us have a dialogue and conversation about the texts of these countries that sometimes gets ignored, or maybe often gets ignored, or the anthology that I'm going to talk about came out recently, and it's very hard to, in the last, I would say, the last 20, 30 years probably, 79, the Iranian Revolution, to do anything from Iran without having the baggage of the Iranian and revolution, then Iran-Iraq war, and then the consequence of the hostage crisis. So that lineage of this whole history makes it impossible to actually generate any work without having to recognize and have to speak to that. And then that gets added on to something like September 11th, and so this kind of thing continues. So I think Aaron Schole's response is directly related to that. Interestingly enough, it ties then later on to the Green Movement, which many of you probably know. Oh, so it's dedicated to Neda, one of the young girls who died during the kind of a democratic movement that happened in Iran for the election, and a few years back. I left a few months before that from Iran. So when she says in the beginning, in what she's trying to do is respond sort of as you would imagine, and as Vic was proposing, to bring a new face to something that people don't understand by presenting these poets from a diverse community. And in the beginning she says, and gives you context of the kind of things these kind of anthologies trying to do. He says, one Saturday afternoon while walking down Melrose Avenue in Los Angeles, I gave into the urge to stop people at random and ask them what came to their mind when I mentioned Iran. Here are some of their responses: Islamic government, human rights violation, a nuclear threat, sponsor of terrorism, Holocaust denier, woman in veils, anti-Semitism, Khomeini's fatwa on Salman Rushdie, enemies of the Israel and the West, the 1979 hostage crisis, and he says only one person had anything positive to say, and it was about some great kebab dish that she had at some restaurant nearby, which in Los Angeles, being the largest Iranian community, would be appropriate to have something good food there. And then she talks about why she presents this. Is when they did this anthology originally, they arrived through this call by Atlantic Review, which does a lot of issues on different countries, and has done Iraq and different countries as a journal, to focus on one country, and they focused on Iran, and she kind of edited this, and it became their most popular issue ever. So then they asked her to expand on it and create an anthology. The anthology is divided in a nice series of different and general ideas and topics, such as the State of Red, the Translation Silence, 99 Names of Exile, Bleeding Green, Rebellious God, and Stepping Through Time. Loosely kind of coordinating poems. It includes poets all the way from Iranian traditional poetry, classical poetry, which includes Rumi, Hafez. Most people didn't recognize those because Rumi actually is a best-selling poet in America. All the way to the contemporary 20th century poets, some of them dead, some of them alive, and then some who are exile poets, and some who write in English as Iranian Americans or people writing about Iranians in English. So the anthology has a very diverse collection of poems with a very different voices from all over the place. It's called Poems from Iran and its Exiles. It already tells you that it's going to have it. And you can tell those kind of difficulty of addressing these type of poetry and how you address them to the public with the name like forbidden, it's a fruit that you shouldn't have or you should have. There's kind of a sexualized or problematic titling of books is something that the Iranians have to deal with. So that when Sholeh did a translation of one of the most important Iranian and woman poet, published by the University of Arkansas Press, by the way, she had to call it Sin, based on the name of a poem of hers, which I will read from the anthology. Then the other poet that I would read, also another woman poet, the other one who actually has a book in English of a 20th century Iranian poet. The book is also called Cup of Sin. Now, you have to think why would be that both women have to be described by taking sinful actions, hence in the West. So there's these kind of difficulties, I guess, arises when you read these kind of books. And then you have the difficulty of what kind of poems you should put in the book. Do you need to put the poems about what Iranians are struggling with? Do you need to make the Iran look good? Do you need to support Iran? Do you need to say that Iran is not like that? I think she does a nice job of not trying to do that, not trying to limit her poetry to one tone, so that many of the poems actually address very much difficulties that poets have about the current regime or the past regimes, censorship, sponsorship of having political prisoners, is all sorts of hard conditions that it has put people under. So to start that, I want to read a poem by one of the major poets of Iran, Ahmad Shamlou, who died, I think 1980? No, 2000. And at 1925 was born. A lot of the Iranian poets, just like in America, that were really important in the 20th century were born in the 1920s. Something about that growing up during the World War II time that creates really amazing writers. Shamlou wrote this poem precisely because some series of events was happening in Iran at the time. I think this is around 80s, where the police would stop up couples walking around and assume that they had been drinking, so they would, or they were holding hands, or they were having intimacy, and would put them in jail because drinking was not allowed, and if you're not like married, you shouldn't be holding hands. And so he responds against that in this poem, where he says, and the poem is called "In This Deadend Road." They sniff your breath, lest you have said, I love you. They sniff your heart, such strange times, my sweet. And they flog love at every checkpoint. We must hide love in the back rooms. In the cold of this dead-end crooked road, they stroke their pyres with our poems and songs. Don't risk things, for these are strange times, my dear. The men who beat at the door in the nadir of night has come to kill the lamp. We must hide in the back room. Those are the butchers in the passageway with their chopping blocks and bloodied cleavage. Such strange times, my sweet. They hack off smiles from faces and songs from mouths. We must hide pleasure in the back room. Canaries are barbecued on the flames of lilies and jasmines. Such strange times, my dear. And the devil, drunk on victory, feasts at the table set for our wake. We must hide God in the back room. And that narrative of hacking smiles, like make people not being able to smile because then that implies something. And this became a very popular resistance poem and familiar. Poetry, as was mentioned earlier, is a very important part of Iranian culture until maybe 20th century, where maybe cinema is becoming a dominant form and fiction has become also a dominant form. Or poetry was the dominant literary form. People memorize poems, people know poems. If you go to an Iranian home, if they're Muslim, obviously they would have Quran, but if they don't have Quran, they would have Hafiz's book. Hafiz's book is very available. You do actually the definition of guessing what the future would be by opening up the Hafiz's book and reading what he says it's in the Yalda, the longest night of the year, everybody gets together and just reads his poems. So it's very the poetry is very close to Iranians, even if they are not reading a lot of these resistant poems or a lot of the great poets of the government is not like promoting them. You would not even Ahmadinejad would quote poetry in his speeches. Khamenei loves poetry and has poetry circles around him where he gives money to poets to support them. So there is a dominant force of Iranian and poets that are also built around that do more conventional poems. So poetry is very much part of the culture. I wanted to read a woman's resistance poem because I'm going to read a little bit of what kind of struggling resistance the Iranian poets are doing, and then maybe a couple of the more positive poems afterwards. Simine Behbahani is still alive, was nominated multiple times for Nobel Peace Prize, was chosen as the MTV's poet laureate. It has won a bunch of awards and continues to stay Iran and boldly speaks against and continues to publish an interview and such a seminally known figure that nothing can really happen to her, so she can actually speak up very freely. Born in 1927, and most of her poems are ghazals, which are a classical form of poetry, but the translations generally are not. Right. And the book begins with one of her poems. That's the person that published the book Cup of Sin that I mentioned. Our tears are sweet. Our tears are sweet. Our laughter venomous. We're pleased when sad, and sad when pleased. We wash one hand in blood, the other we wash the blood off. We cry as we laugh at futility of both these acts. 8 years have passed. We haven't discovered their meaning. We have been like children beyond any account or accounting. We have broken every stalk like a wild wind in the garden. We have picked clean the vine's candelabra, and if we found a tree still standing defiantly, we cut its branches, we pull it by the roots. We wish for war, it brought us misery. Now we repent, we wish for peace. We pull wings and heads from bodies. Now, seeking a cure, we are busy grafting. Will it come to life? Will it fly? The head we attach, the wing we stitch. And this is a response of the 8 years war that happened between Iran and Iraq, a war that started by Iraq, but then continued because Iran was not willing to stop it. And then at the time that it did stop, actually, Khomeini did say that he was drinking the poisonous chalice, to agree to peace. It's an interesting position that he took. But finally, at least, and it was a devastating war. It led to hundreds of thousands of people dying. One of the longest war, one of the longest conventional war between two countries, one of the highest number of casualties in the history of mankind.
North Korea. The introduction to the Iraq literature in the literature of the Axis of Evil describes the plight of living in a dictatorship destroyed by wars, one with Iran and two with the United States. Some of the writers went along with Saddam Hussein, some went into exile, and some fell silent. All of the 5 Iraqi writers represented in the anthology are exiles. Here are 3 of them. I'm not going to give their names. They're difficult for me to pronounce, perhaps, and maybe you wouldn't remember them, but I want to emphasize that the first one I picked wrote in French. That's his Exile. He's now fluent in French. In his poem, Baghdad, My Beloved, he writes of the bitter sorrows of exile, of oppression and war. He lives now in France, but exile is something I have never experienced, so this poem was particularly powerful to me. But to Shireen, are you there? And hello. This poem would be a very strong poem for you, I think. Another poet is writing in German, depicts life under war in his prize-winning novel At the Borderline. And the excerpt in the anthology recounts 2 experiences of a smuggler at the border, crossing a minefield in meticulous detail with his little metal stick, crawling on his belly to get across the minefield. Successfully. It was very suspenseful. I'll never forget it. To reach the border guards, where he must have another extreme or exquisite skill of dealing with the border guards as fellow human beings. Must be quite a novel. The third writer I'll tell about is an excerpt also from a novel set in an Iraqi village during the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran in the 1980s. And it is the zaniest Marx Brothers piece of writing I've read in many, many years. These are all men, from the grandfather to the children, 3, 4 generations who want to avoid military service. And they do it insanely, zanily, trying to get out of the clutches of Saddam Hussein. The author now lives in Spain. The novel, though, was written in Arabic. This anthology is so mixed, so intertwined internationally that it's quite fascinating to me, who taught American and British literature. And now North Korean literature will finish, and time to move to you. The 4 authors selected for North Korea are given this almost the same number of pages as for the Iraqi writers. They don't explain why they've given that attention to the North Koreans, but I'm beginning to guess. But none of them are in exile. They're the opposite of the Iraqi writers. All were published by official magazines or state-run publishing houses. All followed official guidelines, particularly regarding the treatment of the great leader. Biographical information was not available for some of the authors, as though their individuality had been suppressed. So I was surprised by the judgment by the author of the North Korean introduction, who writes, "Nevertheless, what we witness on these pages is the persistent power of the written word, of the willingness to deliver, despite all obstacles, the stories of lives in North Korea as they relate to events we know only from the news, such as their capture of our warship, the Pueblo." This judgment is true. One story, and then I'll stop. One story tells a story about a displaced, poor Korean family living in Japan following World War II. I was already aware of how badly Koreans were treated everywhere as refugees. But this was just one more example. But they were treated so badly in Japan. They were demeaned, so humiliated, so constantly, that they were glad to return to their homeland, Korea. And the great leader was inviting all Koreans to come back because they were in an industrial push and needed workers. Both of the sons of this Korean family were talented. They both learned how to play the trumpet, so unexpected by the Japanese. And it is wonderfully well described how the Japanese reluctantly let them play one trumpet. There was the band leader who recognized their talent and treated them better than anybody else. The parents are proud of them. It's a story of a family raising children. I hope that we have ended in time for you to say what you think, what your thoughts are, because as you can see, this is just the tip of an iceberg of a university course. Please, if you have any thoughts. John?
Oh, well, I notice, I don't believe that we in the U.S. really appreciate several traditions in the general area of Iraq and the Middle East and so forth. And years ago, I received a biography of Wilfred Thesiger, the explorer, the British explorer, who spent a lot of time in the empty quarter in Arabia with these Bedouins almost totally destitute people, the toughest little people he'd ever known. And they had several things. Number one was a tradition of hospitality that he never understood before. A man stumbled into their camp and fairly close to very far down in the desert, and they rushed to this man. They gave him everything. They were just making over him. He couldn't figure out why they were paying so much attention to this bum. And he asked one of his retainers. He had taken two young men as guides and outfitted them and so forth, because he wanted to make an illegal expedition across the several hundred miles of the empty quarter, which had not been done except by two other Europeans. And so he said, what is so great about this? I said, well, he said he had everything. He was a wonderful man. He said, well, what happened to him? He said, he gave it all away. By God, he's generous. He's just such a wonderful, wonderful man. He's so generous. And Thesiger was mad at one of his retainers because he bought some new clothing for him. And the next time he saw him, he had the same old loincloth on. They said, what happened? That I gave it to so-so. He said, what for? What'd you do that for? He asked for it. He said, what do you think I'd do? And Thesiger never really understood this, and yet he admired it tremendously. Another thing, well, of course, was their extreme love of poetry. These are illiterate people, but they had this wonderful reverence for poetry, and they would really tremendous respect for anyone who could do this. He found the same thing in the outback parts of Syria during World War II when he was with the British SAS special services running behind the German lines and so forth. And the hospitality extended to the point that they felt that they're actually, he says, that they actually had a duty to defend a guest or a fugitive that they took in to the death, even against their own family. Anyone who threatened the life of a guest, this was, it amounted to a holy duty. And I don't think we understand that either, particularly when the Taliban offered to put their main refugee, I guess, at the moment, I can't remember the name.
He was?
Who had fled into Afghanistan, put him on trial there. But of course, naturally, the U.S. refused that because everything has to be done under our auspices and our venue.
And in places that are more remote, or at least still being followed. And poetry across the Middle East does have that huge close connection to the people, and that's something that continues there. In Yemen, they have dialogues in which you actually write the poet would write like a poem. They do debates on ideas through poems, where they would do a tape of like this. One poet would make its tape of like one argument, and then the next week you can go get the response of the other poet responding to, and they go back and forth, bantering on different topics and things like that. And it's very popular. Everybody wants to follow. Everybody's waiting to see how I would respond to this last response. So that poetic debates, it's where they would use all their tricks, all their clever skills to talk back and forth. It does actually exist, and it becomes a form of politics.
The more I learn about the diversity, the more astonished I am at myself for having swallowed so many simplicities for so many years. On the one hand, this hospitality. On the other hand, one thing I think I read in the book, in the Poetry of the Taliban, is that the Afghans in the 19th century faced two British armies at different times. And one British army they annihilated except for one man who was a doctor. He was the only person to escape from Afghanistan alive of the entire army. And yet, we find every kind of person that you described there, and you're describing. Please, other comments?
I'm really curious
Questions?
about how it happened that the United States never developed this kind of tradition. And I just wonder, you know, you're looking at it from outside that culture, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Do you mean
Of generosity?
No,
No.
of
Poetry.
the poetry.
Oh, portrait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, probably because of the competition of other fields of writing and maybe potentiality of the fact that it's you know, it's a later culture that therefore the other fields dominated more, or it's definitely clearly not as paramount. But at that time they would, you know, I mean, in some of these cultures, there's in also it's like in Africa, but not so much recently in Iran, and there are poets like in North Africa region. There are poets, and we're going to get them from Moroccan and visitors that have been coming this year. The poet goes around and like holds your story, and your family story is permanently made to a song that you. And then you're always guesting him. You know, you bring him in, you take care of him, and you do all these nice things to him, and then they would deliver you a song. They could sing forever. So your narrative of your life, family, or so is maintained. So they're very, you know, it becomes very much part of that kind of a unusual way of maintaining it. In the earlier part of the Iranian tradition, all the mystic poetries were a way of expressing it. And somebody like Rumi has two sets of poetry. One is a very educational poetry. It's poetry where it's 6-volume books where it's basically like the second Quran for many people, a mystical way of teaching Quran, a very different way of teaching in Islamic beliefs. And it's all written in poetic form or in rhyme couplets. And he has a whole series of ghazals in which he's talking about his longing, and there are more of desires. Where he expresses his emotional desires. So that, you know, so there's like these different traditions are all transformed and become available through poetic form. Even the court, one of the dominant form of like praising or supporting the king was in the form of poetry. So there would be poets who would be spending a lot of time doing that, but then also doing very interesting things in the way that they would praise the king. They would praise the king and also like put in certain their own commentary, like, but if you do this more, then you'll be even better. You know, like they would educate the king through their dialogue of reading poetics while they're praising. And somebody like Ferdowsi, who wrote almost 50-some thousand couplets in 30 years, this biggest book of poetry ever written by one person. It's an epic of the Iranian history. So it's like it starts from the beginning, where it kind of goes, and it's all the stories told, narratives told, and things like that. So those kind of things become very much then part of the culture. You know, definitely not here. And so when the culture is born that way, I think inherently you keep it, even if you, you know, all these poets are like radicals or oppositional or trying to, it doesn't matter. You still like the poetry, maybe, you know, and you go back to the old one. So there, in Iran, for example, the conflict itself and to do a lot of the older poets, and ignore the newer poets if the person is very much more conservative.
Of course, the time spans are so vastly different between you have thousands of years there.
Right, that's what I mentioned actually. Yeah, that is one of the key factors. Persian language, interestingly enough, hasn't changed for almost 1100 years. There's the text of the poetry I can teach is somebody could have read over 1,000 years ago.
What do you suppose that is?
You know,
Why would it not change for 100 years?
It's very unusual for the language to last that long for Iran, and especially given the fact that you imagine and Islam took over Iran. Iran was an empire before that, and yet still didn't lose the language.
Yeah,
Almost, yeah, it does not change. It's almost every other empire that the Arab world took over, they replaced the language. Like Egyptians, you know, and North Africans and things like that. But Persians did not. They maintained it. Partially because maybe potentially that empire was very strong and they were cleverly able to manipulate it.
They're sort of unique.
Yeah, it's very unusual.
In their ethnic makeup and their bloodline and everything.
Yeah, right, definitely.
In relation to Afghanistan, is technology important here? That in the United States, we had technology, we could then print all of these novels that we have enjoyed in our history,
Right.
but not in Afghanistan. They lacked that. Memory was so important in the oral tradition. But Gladys, we also have an oral tradition in the United States, and we have folklorists here in Fayetteville by the hundreds.
We're kind of short on roomies, though.
See, these are short poems we're talking about. Right? Well, thank you all for coming.